liberty to correct anything that I say.
Thank you, Mr. President. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to beautiful Montpelier. And thank you, Mr. President, President James Madison of the United States. We've managed to time travel a little bit on this day. We're on the 15th of July of 1821, and we are in the presence of Mr. Madison, and in which His Excellency is going to share with us some of the experiences here in the United States, particularly as it pertains to the constitutional, but also particularly the Bill of Rights. So thank you very much for hosting us today, Mr. President.
I'm very pleased to have your company here at my home at Montpelier. It's a wonderful place to be, and presumably away from the vicissitudes of politics that seem to plague the rest of the world. We can have a conversation free from intercession and free from the vitriol that may exist otherwise.
Indeed, indeed. And in a place like this, I'm sure some of the thoughts are much more readily available in the quiet of Montpelier than it would be in the busy hallways of
Congress.
Mr. President, I wanted, not a lot of people in the Lebanon, which is where we're coming to visit you from, are actually very familiar with the role that Virginia played in sowing the seeds of liberty in the United States, but also generally across the world. I wonder if you could share with us a few thoughts on why you think it came about that this energy generated out of Virginia from individuals such as yourself, your friend, Mr. Jefferson, and also, I guess, a mentor to all that was George Washington. And then, would you share some of those thoughts and why Virginia really sowed the seeds of liberty throughout the world?
Well, my first thought is some of the reflections that may emanate from Boston and Philadelphia, who might take exception to the idea that liberty emanated from Virginia. One curious nature of those events that took place in the 1750s and further on, which led us to our Declaration of Independence, saw elements of liberty existing in many of the different states, perhaps more preeminently in Boston with the obstruction of the rights of those in Boston, and then Philadelphia certainly. Virginia had its own role during this time. I was personally witness to what I thought were abuses of the established church in the preventing of Moravians and Baptists and others from preaching without incurring fines or being imprisoned without proper licenses to do so. It has always been my thought that the right of conscience is most preeminent amongst the rights of individuals. And wherever I saw that being a source of obstruction on the part of either religion or governments or whatever, it needed to be reversed. And so I think in Virginia, our first messages are religious intoleration or toleration, as Mr. Mason would say, a growing belief that the individuals had certain extent rights. Even as Englishmen, we had those rights, but the British government was not acknowledging it. And in witnessing some of the abuses that were made by the Anglican Church here, even in Orange County, it affected me greatly when I returned from the College of New Jersey in my Princeton. Yes, 22. Even in Princeton, there were statements being made and actions being taken to thwart some of the British actions in New Jersey, and it reflected in all the colonies. And as these abuses grew, we started to organize committees of correspondence to correspond with the abuses of the English governor in Virginia, Dunmore, and the effects of British government both in law and in religion. And these became points of exacerbation and exasperation rather, and points of reflection. And in in singular instances, perhaps less grave, uncomfortable, but in the accumulative effect of these events, it becomes noticeable.
It's interesting that you would mention that some of the issues started as far back as the 1750s, whereas, you know, as we now all know, of course, the revolution and the Declaration of Independence happened almost a quarter of a century after, in 1776. So it's almost a culmination of a build-up, from what I'm understanding you say, of certain grievances, both against the British king in some cases, but also against the abuses of fellow citizens or fellow sects, etc., that were abusive. So it was kind of like a mix of all of these building up to this massive Declaration of Independence. For those who may not be as familiar, of course, there were some notable characters within the Virginia establishment, if you will, such as you mentioned George Mason and Patrick Henry. I'd like to kind of stop for a second at your friend Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, of course. Why did it have to be Thomas Jefferson? Why couldn't it have been somebody from Boston? As you well said, there's that high intellect coming out of Boston from Harvard College and other places. Mm-hmm. Why did it fall on Mr. Jefferson himself and the Virginia influence that came out of it?
Well, I was not there at the time. In 1776, I was part of the provisional legislature in Virginia, the House of Burgesses, where we were discussing a constitution for Virginia at the time after the declaration was being made. In fact, we even called for that declaration to be made during that session in June 1776 in Virginia. Mr. Jefferson was one of our representatives in Philadelphia at the time. I had not been introduced to him. I did not know him until the following fall of 1776. But I understand the case being that Mr. Adams was certainly preeminent figure to push for the Declaration of Independence in that Second Continental Congress, that he thought that his ability to write, although prodigious his writing, it's very effectual writing on matters of law. He did attend that college, I think they call it Harvard, we've heard of it here in Virginia, to attend that. And he thought it would be better to come from Virginia, the largest colony. They're 7 times the size of Delaware at the time, just to give a sense of perspective. Virginia was the largest colony. And having the preeminence of Virginia at the head of such a declaration, and even to ask for Mr. Washington, Colonel Washington, to become the General of the Army in Boston, was a significant step in uniting colonies that were otherwise not as entirely united as some might have felt. Considering the events that took place since then, we begin to figure the differences, the strong differences amongst the different colonies, and they're harboring a very strong sense of state independence from all the other states as well as from England. And to unite those states, they had a common language in many instances, but there are an awful lot of differences amongst the states, and this is what had to be broken down. And the call for Virginia to participate, the strength of that call comes from Philadelphia, comes from Boston. But we had numerous individuals in Virginia, not only those preeminent such as Mr. Washington, General Washington, and Mr. Jefferson, but other figures in Virginia that played a significant role. Richard Henry Lee is a very dynamic individual, certainly Patrick Henry was at the time. John Taylor from Caroline County. There are a host of Indian Nicholas, George Nicholas also, and James Innes. These are individuals in Virginia who perhaps will not receive world renown, but the numbers that they represent, the education they represent, many were educated in Europe and brought back to Virginia, some educated at the College of William and Mary, such as Mr. Jefferson. But this, the dominant role that many of them played was the articulation of ideas that emanated from Virginia.
Which was fascinating, because in reality a lot of those ideas emanated from the Enlightenment, but also from a lot of the research that you and that a very enlightened generation of thinkers in Virginia and overall throughout the colonies, based on experiences that you drew not only from from Europe of the age and Enlightenment, but also back into ancient times. If I'm not mistaken, you had to go back and research a lot of what had happened with a lot of the republics, why they had succeeded or failed, etc., etc. Is that correct?
Oh, very much so. The nature of our union at the outbreak of the revolution and carried us through to 1789 were the Articles of Confederation, which was an effort to conjoin the various states into a league and that would speak as one voice when it came to commerce in foreign countries. You remember at the time after the war was over in 83, many of the states considered themselves so independent they would send their own ambassadors to Spain or to France to negotiate treaties of commerce with the respective states. And that would have the effect of harming other states. There was an effort in 1785 with John Jay and Mr. Gardocki to negotiate the giving up of American rights to the Mississippi in order to increase fisheries in Massachusetts in their trade with Spain. And this giving up of certain assumptions of authority and domain that occurred after the revolution it was very confused because each of the states operated so uniquely, so differently from the other states. And this union, of this confederation, was very loose. It had very little treaty-making power to speak for all the states. It had very little commercial power, very little power in establishing currency amongst the states, trade amongst the states, delineation of state lines. We had one meeting considering the use of the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia. Who had control of the Potomac? Who had control of fishing in the Chesapeake? And these instances grew, particularly after the war was over. The war united the states. But after the war was over, these states were left free to deal with Indian tribes in the West, the use of British troops in the